figure out who our audience is today. So as we kind of go along, that can kind of help kind of frame and help me figure out. So it should have just automatically launched. Feel free to answer those quick questions about your orchard and how many trees you're planning to prune this season. So this fruit tree pruning class has been one I've been teaching since about 2017. It originally was started as a way to kind of address something that my family was encountering. My grandparents passed away about 2015, and they left behind a family orchard in Tennessee. This was an orchard that had about 75 trees, and it was established in the early 80s with a mixture of standard, dwarf, and semi-dwarf trees, some of which came from Stark Brothers, some of which came kind of locally through some of the fruit orchards that they knew in the area. But it was something that we now inherited, where we needed to get these fruit trees back in shape. And really, these were fruit trees that had been heavily neglected. As you can also imagine, we were approaching our orchard from an emotional standpoint, where we really wanted to keep these trees in shape and just keep them growing, and to honor my grandparents. So when developing the extension class in 2017, a lot of the photos I initially used were my own, kind of what we were encountering. As I have delivered this every year, and usually 2 or 3 times in a given year, I have encountered that people have similar situations where they have old and neglected trees, and they also maybe have an emotional attachment to these trees as well. And so that's what I've really tried to do in guiding this intro to fruit tree production class. Since 2017, we've had close to 600 people go through this class. And in some of the way I teach it of color coding, in a given year, I might be color coding 45 to 50 people's fruit trees. So instead of going to your backyard or to your orchard and being able to provide that hands-on, I instead am kind of coloring the trees for you and then sending you on your way, but hopefully giving you some confidence to do this on your own. This, of course, is kind of wrapping up our fruit tree class for the year. So really happy to have folks join us here today. So let's see where we're at with our poll. We've had a lot of people. Hold on. We've had a lot of folks submit their answers already. So I will go ahead and end the poll and should be able to share the results. All right, so let's look and see. Primarily 71% are about non-commercial. We have some individuals that are commercial production. We have those that are considered not applicable, so they might not be pruning for that season, or they might be helping out others, or they don't have fruit trees just yet. Orchards, primarily 76% is palms, so apples, pears, crab apples. We do have some stone fruit as well, 43% with peaches, plums, cherries, and apricot. And then our final question, I have pruned or plan to prune for the season. 52% have less than 5 trees. We have 2 individuals that have, or rather 6 individuals that have 6 to 10 fruit trees they plan to prune. 11 to 20 trees, they have 1 person, and then 21 to 50 trees is 2 people. And then someone has more than 50 trees. I know who that person is. So that kind of gives us an idea of what we're really talking about here. And this is typically also what we see when I teach this class. I'm going to stop my video and I'll turn my video back on at the end of today. So to give you a little bit more about who I am, I'm a local foods and small farms educator in Northern Illinois with University of Illinois Extension. So I cover Daviess-Stephenson and Winnebago counties. I know that there are individuals here from around the state. And so just kind of know that when I talk about fruit tree pruning, a lot of times I'm kind of keeping in mind that some of what I'm saying may look different for you. You may be already ahead of us when it comes to fruit tree production and pruning, or you may be a little behind as well. You may have a little bit more wiggle room, if you will, for some of this. But I'm right on the Wisconsin state line with this. My programming area is soil management. I work with commercial and non-commercial fruit and vegetable growers. So those growing in the backyard, homeowners, community gardens, as well as also working with those that are commercial, and tend to focus a lot on insect and disease management for this group and this audience. My planting zone is 5B. When we talk about fruit tree pruning in Northern Illinois, we typically are suggesting mid-December to about March 1st is kind of our period of time. And we'll go into more pruning basics as we go along today, but that tends to be where we tend to really focus in on. What that also means is that we do not see commercial stone fruit production in Northern Illinois. It's too cold. Our weather just does not allow for commercial peach tree and other stone fruit production. It is very common to have stone fruit in the backyard. It is very common for a small farm that maybe has 5 or 6 peach trees to grow it, but we do not see a large commercial scale of stone fruit that you would see in central and southern Illinois. That being said, you see a photo of me holding a peach tree here, or a peach rather, and this is from our Rockford office. We have 2 peach trees behind our Rockford office. You'll see some photos of them as we go along today. One of them is a standard peach tree. The other one is I believe it's a Semi-Dwarf tree based on its age and height. And they're about 12 years old, these peach trees are, before my time. So today's plan is going to get into that intro. It's going to be very focused on these pruning basics and some of these common questions that you might be thinking to yourself that you just need to know and need to answer in order to comfortably go out and prune those trees that you're dealing with. I'm trying to approach it from both that you might have an old and neglected fruit tree that you've inherited, you've purchased property and you now have this fruit tree, along with those that are maybe are newly established in the last couple of years. Certainly with some of the participant photos that came through, a lot of you are growing new fruit trees that have just been planted in the last 3 years. And so that will also be the approach we try to take today, as well as even mentioning kind of that commercial scale as ways of thinking of pruning your trees too. We'll get into some of those general cuts you need to make and some of the issues you're going to encounter when it comes to just getting out there and pruning your trees. And then a lot of examples from past participants in this course, along with participants from the course today who have sent in photos. And we're going to kind of walk through these as examples to really think about how you might approach pruning your trees and getting them into the right shape. And we'll end with next cuts and kind of introduce that too. The photo you see here is a variety called Virginia Beauty. It was one of my grandparents' trees. It was planted about 1983. It's a very old heirloom variety. It's a standard tree of about, at this point, it's about 35 feet tall. It's a very well-loved tree, but as you can see, we have some things we need to do with this tree. There are places that it needs to be pruned based on the structure and what it looks like. So as we think about kind of these pruning basics and getting started with pruning, or even just now you're approaching pruning after maybe a couple years of wanting a refresher, you have to go in thinking about what your expectations are. Sometimes if you are just expecting that you want to give the tree a little bit of pruning, just kind of provide something, some form of attention, that may lead into a better shape of your tree, but it may not necessarily lead towards those yields that you're really expecting. You compare that to the commercial standpoint where you're going to be pruning them with purpose, that you're going to be pruning them to ensure that you have marketable fruit to then sell at a farmer's market, marketable fruit that can be picked by folks maybe coming to your orchard, as well as marketable fruit that might be easy for individuals that work for you to be able to harvest effectively and efficiently. But also recognizing too that sometimes your goal doesn't always align with the tree that you have perhaps, and you have to kind of think about that with your expectations. It's very important to know the tree. While you may not know the variety, which can be a common thing that we really encounter in parts of Northern Illinois and the counties that I serve, you can really know what fruit you have. You obviously know if it's an apple or a pear or whether it's stone fruit. And from there, knowing that type of tree will guide you into the shape that you should be after. Realistically, when we think about apples and pears, we're aiming for getting that tree in a pyramid central leader style. Both of those words tend to be very interchangeable. You might also consider that it's a Christmas tree type shape. So thinking about those kind of lower branches that are very horizontal, and they are the longest ones at the base of the tree, and then higher up in that tree, you still have horizontal branches, and they all are growing up against a central leader. The compass, the open fruit bowl, vase shape, all of those work very well for peaches, for cherry, and for some of those other stone fruit. It can also be very common to have stone fruit that are on a pyramid or central leader style. But if you're starting off and you're just getting planted in the last 2 or 3 years, you have the ability to push your stone fruit towards the peaches, towards the open fruit bowl kind of vase shape. At the same time, consider what the height of that tree is, especially if you have one that's been established for years and years, or you're planting and not just planted the last couple of years, you already have an idea of its maturity height, whether it's a dwarf, semi-dwarf, standard. By knowing that distinction of its expected maturity height, it's going to give you a greater understanding of knowing how much you can prune off in a given year, as well as the ability to manage them in a certain way too. All of which we'll talk about more to come as we go along today. This is one of our cherry trees in the back at our Rockford, Winnebago office, one that I have been working on for a number of years now. It was planted before my time, and so with this tree, I'm just trying to kind of see if we can get it into kind of that open fruit bowl shape. You kind of see that you'll see it a little bit more as we go along today, but it's one that I also am probably accepting that it's not going to be the best shape it can be, or the ideal shape that it can be too. So some of those pruning basics. As mentioned already, when to prune, we're aiming for mid-December to March 1st. You might be able to push this a little bit further. You might be able to push it into mid-March. The challenge that we really encounter is that sometimes you may be making so many severe cuts on that tree that it may not have enough time to properly heal up. And so by pushing it further into March, sometimes you encounter that the actual amount of pruning that you want to do, you may not be able to do as much that season because it's much later. Another thing to mention is that most of the time, the pruning tends to be done in our area by sometimes mid-February. In fact, most of the Rockford, Northern Illinois orchards have really wrapped up their pruning for the season already, and they're finishing up this week and next. So realistically, that's kind of the timeline that we're really after, is try to begin to wrap things up March 1st if you can, especially for any big limbs that you feel need to come out that season. How much to prune? You may find you've got a tree that needs a lot of pruning and a lot of removal. And yet the trees can really only withstand about 30 to 40% every single year. So as you look at your fruit tree and think of it as 100%, then step back and think about what 30 to 40% of the overall branches would be. And think of it in some ways as like a mathematical equation where you're adding a big limb here, smaller branches coming out. And you may find that 30 to 40% adds up really quickly. On a dwarf and semi-dwarf tree, it certainly can. On a standard tree, maybe it's 25, 30 feet tall that you have, that might be quite a lot that you may never really achieve every single year. A common question we have is, should I seal up the cuts? If I am making a big cut on this tree, should I apply a pruning sealant? And we do not recommend a pruning sealant. You see it all the time at home and garden centers, right beside the pruners, right beside the other equipment for pruning. And yet this locks in moisture and potentially could actually kill the tree by using this pruning seal. If you are pruning during the right time of the season, if you are pruning correctly when it comes to the cut that you're making, you will find that the cut will seal up properly. Even if you have damage, say in the fall or in the summer from weather or deer or other wildlife, we would still not recommend using this product because it's going to lock in moisture and potentially it's going to kill that tree. So ignore this product and do not use it. What about dormant oil? Dormant oil is one that has been recommended on occasion for some older plantings, and historically it sometimes was used kind of hand in hand with pruning. And it really is kind of a type of a mineral oil that's applied to kind of the bark and parts of the limbs of the tree. It tends to address smaller insects, scales, aphids, some of those other ones, but it needs to be applied when temperatures are in the 30s and the 40s. So while this is still within kind of that dormancy period of your fruit trees, you may find that it's not needed depending on how many trees you have. And we don't always see it used quite often. And frankly, it can sometimes be very difficult to even find this dormancy oil. I think the other thing to recognize is that this is not going to address those bigger destructive summer insects on fruit trees that people get more concerned about. So some of the plum curculio, some of the apple maggots that are highly destructive on your fruit trees, this dormant oil is not going to address it. It's not going to address those big destructive insects that you might be dealing with and encountering. So should you top a tree? So say you've got a big fruit tree and it's kind of taken over your property. It's 45, 50 feet tall, which we do encounter in Northern Illinois, very large fruit trees. We do not recommend topping the tree. And you see the action here. This topping of the tree is coming through and it basically is doing a heading cut. And by doing this heading cut, yes, it might be alleviating some of those limbs, but that action is going to then lead to more of these shoots develop. So it's never really addressing that main problem you have. It's just going to keep this cycle going. And it just results in very aggressive growth. The other problem with this action is that you now have all of those cuts that have to be sealed up naturally in the next period of time before your tree moves to its next growth stage. So it can be a little bit hard to, so it's just not recommended because it's going to be very difficult for this tree to heal up those cuts properly. And it just could potentially kill the tree in the future because there could be openings where it wasn't healed up correctly. So what if it has been topped? So say it has been topped in one season and then you come out and now you have all this aggressive growth and you just don't really know where to begin. One of the things that we would try to really recommend is to kind of use a thinning cut. So you would try to come in at the side and you would try to kind of do a lower cut, lower at the base of on that tree trunk. So try to remove a bigger one of those if you really can, would be what we would recommend. So lower down at the tree, make it right where the trunk is, and remove a cut for the rest of that. So what about summer pruning then? From a non-commercial standpoint, from a backyard production system, or smaller scale production, we wouldn't recommend summer pruning. It just is incompatible to the growth stage of your fruit trees. We just find that it's just not ideal for what you want to do. We get that it's very tempting, especially knowing that, okay, you've pruned in the dormant period, you come out to your orchard in summertime, and you've got a lot of this growth, and it's very tempting, and you want to prune some of this out. And yet it's just very incompatible. If you were, say, a commercial grower, you might do a little bit of summer pruning in which you would try to come in here and there and maybe try to bring in more sunlight for some of the fruit that has already been developed. But we're not talking about large pruning out of big limbs. We're really just kind of talking about maybe some of those smaller limbs that might be shading the fruit that was already developing. And this is sometimes done potentially, you might be looking at doing this maybe mid-August or first week or two of August, where you already have this fruit that has developed and you're trying to get a little bit more sunlight to kind of part of the tree to give some better quality. But we're really not talking about a lot of pruning happening here. And yet again, if I had a smaller planting, I'm probably not going to do a summer pruning. This would be more on a commercial scale where I have the ability to do that and where my end goal is to get better looking fruit to be able to sell. This would be the time to focus on training, bending some of these branches back to really get the structure that you really need is what we would recommend and try to do this. You definitely do not do any of your normal pruning in late summer or fall. So if you didn't get around to pruning the next 6 weeks, or rather the next couple of weeks, this is not meaning that you're going to push all of that pruning into the late summer or fall. And the reason being that limb removal is going to lead to cuts that need to be sealed up properly. And because you're not in dormancy, any weather issues where it's getting colder is going to impact it if you're pruning in late summer, early fall. There's just not enough time for those cuts to seal up properly before it gets cold. For the pruning of the dwarf and semi-dwarf, everything we talk about today as far as that 30 to 40%, the limbs that you want to remove, all of that's going to do fine when it comes to the dwarf and semi-dwarf trees. So very similar approach to standard trees. One of the benefits with a dwarf or a semi-dwarf tree is that you can address problems based on height and age. So because these trees are not going to reach that standard height of 25, 30 feet that we sometimes see, you can really address the limb problems early on and potentially even like later on in the life of the tree, because you're really not dealing with very big limbs at this point. You're really able to address it. It's also one where you might consider doing continual scaffold replacements, especially as some of these scaffolds maybe are around for 10 or 12 years. You may find that you want to be renewing them every year. The scaffold being the branch that is staying completely horizontal and where your fruit is being produced off of it. So you may find that over time you want to just remove a scaffold and then find a new replacement scaffold nearby underneath it, and just kind of keeping a central kind of main trunk of the tree in place. One thing I would also state is that if you have a tree of dwarf or semi-dwarf that's less than 4 years old, don't focus so much on the pruning these first couple of years. Really focus on the training, bending these branches back, placing spreaders between that scaffold branch and the central leader in order to really allow for the right tree structure and the right tree shape that you're after. And then once you start producing fruit, then start doing a little bit more pruning. And this is something I've had to really think more about too. This peach tree that you see here, this will be its 3rd year. And so the 2nd year, there was some pruning done. And yet in kind of stepping back and thinking about the direction I wanted for this semi-dwarf peach tree to go, I decided to not do as much pruning this year. And there's a little pruning that was done on this tree, but nowhere near what I was really thinking about doing in the previous years. My focus now has been training these branches, pulling them back, spreading them, trying to create the shape that I'm really after, knowing full well that in the next year 5 or year 6, is when I could really start doing more pruning that I need to do. So what about those fruit tree problems? When you grow fruit trees in the Midwest, they can be notorious for problems. And you sometimes have to accept that this is a crop that can grow well for you, but also this is a crop that can really have issues for you. And a lot of it is very dependent on the season. If you have no yields, one of the first things to bring up, especially on a smaller scale, is that you need more than one variety of apples flowering at the same time. We have had numerous calls at the extension office with folks that say, I have 10 Honeycrisp apple trees in my backyard. This is now year 7. They have never produced for me. What's the problem? And when we talk more to this homeowner or others, they only have one variety. So they need more than one variety flowering at the same time to allow for proper cross-pollination for apples. You could get this from a neighbor's apple tree or a neighbor's crab apple tree, but just know that that can sometimes be a problem, especially if you're just getting started in your journey in fruit tree production. Northern Illinois is notorious for late spring frosts, and we see this quite often where the buds are starting to open up and the buds have developed really quickly for apples, and a late spring frost can kill the buds or result in severe bud damage. We saw this quite a lot last May with some of the varieties that were grown in Northern Illinois. And it's something that you just maybe need to expect with some of these apples, is that they may be able to survive the winters and most seasons. However, it's that late spring frost that has been doing some damage to them. And we might even call this a late spring freeze, depending on the season. You may also find when you look at your fruit trees that you have more foliage than actual apple kind of fruit buds. It could be that the structure of your tree is in such a way that it's focused much heavier on the fruit, on foliage and leaf material than it is on the actual buds. And we'll show photos of what this looks like, the buds, so you can kind of see it at this point. For Northern Illinois, peaches, plums, stone fruit, very cold winter sees no fruit. That's just to be expected, that there's going to be good years for peaches and plums, and there's going to be more often than not bad years for them. -8 degrees Fahrenheit tends to be the cutoff. So if we reach temperatures of -8 degrees for usually 3 to 4 days in a row, there's a strong chance those peach buds or stone fruit buds have not survived. Now, every growing area is different. Every growing area has little microclimates that allow for temperatures to be cold, but maybe not that cold. So you may be in a good spot where the survivability is possible. But certainly if we have had periods where it's really cold beyond -8 for usually 3 to 4 days in a row as lows, there's a strong chance you don't have them. That's just the way it is with these. As you look at both those examples, temperature, weather-wise, that's a little bit out of your control. And you just have to expect that and unfortunately accept that too. If you had no yield the last year, but maybe you had a good year before, you could be in a state of biennial fruiting, where you have a heavy fruit load one year and the tree has devoted so much energy that one year that now the next year it has kind of pulled back and it's not producing as much fruit for you. Pruning should help alleviate this. By pruning your trees, this should help get you out of a period of biennial fruiting. Cold spring, yet again, could also be killing some of it. So recognize that. You might also consider that patience is needed. I know that we like this immediate satisfaction of pruning fruit trees. And yet if you have a young tree, if you have not pruned for years and now you're just starting to prune, you need to give the tree some time. You may not see those yields that you're expecting this upcoming year because the tree is just now getting the sunlight that it needs, or getting the space that it needs, or it's not getting the shade problems that it has. So it can take a little bit of time to get this fruit buds to where it needs to be. Excessive fruit drop can also be common on fruit tree. So trees will drop fruit typically sometimes mid-July. In our area when they've been pruned. So even by pruning should help to alleviate excessive fruit drop, but note that sometimes the tree will still want to do this. If this happens severely, you may potentially be having a soil issue, or you may be having some other environmental issue that's happening with this tree, that even if you're doing everything you can, like pruning, and it's dropping everything, there could be some other problem happening here. Let's talk about our pruning goals then. As much as it is, yet again, think about what your expectations are, this gets more to the point of, what are we really trying to do when we're pruning? One of the main things to think about with pruning is that we are trying to bring sunlight to your branches. If you have a tree that is standard size, 25, 30 feet, maybe even a semi-dwarf that's 14 to 16 feet, you may notice that the fruit is higher up in the tree where the sunlight is hitting those branches. And we need to bring sunlight to the branches. We need to bring the branches the sunlight that it needs lower down in the tree so that you can harvest from them and so that you can get the fruit that you want. We also want to consider developing scaffold branches closer to harvest level. And we'll go into more detail about what we mean here as far as a scaffold branch. But just note the scaffold branches will be the ones that really will hold the fruit that your fruit tree is going to be yielding and giving to you. We also want to consider reducing our cuts. So as we think about what our tree shape and structure really looks like, we don't necessarily want to be able to go through there and have, say, 15 cuts on a single branch. We might try to see if we could just do one single cut and really reduce the amounts of cuts we're doing. Because based on the type of cut we're doing, there can be a strong chance that that's going to lead to more aggressive growth and potentially lead to more foliage growth and not enough fruit bud development. We want to prune out wood that interferes with trees' productivity. Sometimes it's a big branch, a big cut that needs to be made. And by removing that one branch, it could dramatically transform that fruit tree and put it on the right path towards where it needs to be. We might also consider achieving a shape and a height that works for you. You know, if you have trees in the backyard, but you need to mow under these trees, that means that your scaffold level may not be at 2 feet to 3 feet, that first level. We may want to go higher up because you need to get under there and you need to prune correctly. You may also find that depending on what you're wanting to do, perhaps you're commercial and you want to have U-pick operation, you need to have a shape that works well for people to come out and pick those apples compared to if it was in the backyard. We also want to look to keep disease from spreading, and we want to prune with a long-term focus. That's really something to consider, is that fruit tree pruning is something you're going to need to do on a yearly basis. By putting it off for a couple of years, by doing it once every 3 to 4 years, you're not going to get that tree to where it needs to be producing fruit for you on a consistent and yearly basis. The photo you see here is that dormant stage for an apple. So when we talk about pruning during dormancy, we're looking at those buds to ensure that we're still within that dormancy period. And I will send you a handout of different colors of what these are so that you have it for reference. One of the ways that I tend to approach this course of Intro to Fruit Tree Production, pruning rather, is breaking things in 2 directions. We have what's called high productivity. So it could be that you've inherited a group of trees that maybe are old and neglected, or you have a tree that has just been planted the last 4 or 5 years, or maybe something that's even, say, 8 to 12 years. And it's this idea that every year you're taking off 30 to 40%. And potentially, especially for an old and neglected tree, we're going to try to get it in tip-top shape in 3 years. So it is that 30 to 40% coming off every single year, some of which might be new branches as they are developed, new shoots or so forth, but we're going to really go for this. This high productivity tends to work very well for dwarf and semi-dwarf trees, where we can easily kind of do this for very well-established trees. For standard trees, especially if it's a tree that's 25, 30 feet tall, it can be very difficult to do this high productivity, especially if you have not pruned your tree for years and years, or you've inherited property and the trees are there. This would be things such as big limbs, maybe 2 to 3 come out. We would take out suckers, water sprouts, smaller limbs, all kind of on a yearly basis. And then every single year we would be assessing. We would see how the tree has reacted, how the tree has performed, and then maybe modifying and changing that every single year. You also may have a toleration tree. It could be that, okay, I'm just going to give this tree a little bit of attention. I might take out a big limb. I might just aim for those water sprouts along the base of the tree. I might do some thinning cuts where I take out a limb here or there. But you're not going to think that you're going to transform your tree really, really dramatically. It could be that you're just doing some toleration pruning. You're hoping for the best and kind of going from there, trying to bring in the light and really see how that tree is reacting. And some of this is large limbs that are interfering with equipment. They're dead, they're kind of out of the way. This is that Virginia beauty tree you saw earlier. So yet again, a standard tree, we're kind of approaching as more a toleration tree. I think the other thing to recognize is that a toleration tree might be one that, you want to keep it around because you just like that there's this tree. While you could find it as a dwarf or semi-dwarf and eventually replace it, your approach here is that you're just tolerating it, you're just giving it some attention. You may find that you have both of these. You may find that you have trees that could easily be high productivity, where every year I'm going to come in 30 to 40%, compared to a toleration tree where I may take out a large limb here or there. I might see how the tree reacts. I expect, maybe yields every year or two and go from there. So some of the equipment, especially starting off, you see here with our loppers here up in the left corner that would work really well for some of our limbs. You also know it's very telescopic, so the ability to kind of pull these back and be able to get higher up in that tree. This can work really well for some of those smaller limbs that you might be encountering. Most of these loppers tend to also have a certain width to them, so it may not work for all of your branches. Otherwise, some of the saws that you see here could work really well for some of those kind of nooks and crannies that you need to get into, especially if it's a tree that has been, say, neglected for a number of years. And then some pruners, some very quick pruners there at the base you could use for some of those smaller water sprouts, depending on how you're cutting it and kind of what that tree shape is. Rubbing alcohol is here as well. And the reason for this is that we do want to be mindful of using between trees, dipping some of our pruners in rubbing alcohol to ensure that we're not spreading disease. This is a time where you could potentially spread disease, and we really want to lessen the spread of it by trying to clean between trees with rubbing alcohol, which you can find as a spray bottle and would spray on it. Some of your bigger cuts, we would probably recommend more of a chainsaw, especially if it's a limb that you find is obviously going to take time and you're just not going to be able to take it out with either of these saws that you see here. From a commercial standpoint, the hydraulic, gas, electric pruners would all be ones that we would recommend, especially if you had a number of trees that would be very difficult to prune quickly. And maybe our dwarf or semi-dwarf, we would push more towards a hydraulic, gas, or electric pruners for that method. You occasionally see smaller electric gas pruners, and these can work fairly well depending on the limbs. Yet again, I think it's approaching the tree limbs with the tools. So it is that these tools may work well for some trees, but they may not work for all of them. They may work well for a dwarf, semi-dwarf, but they may not work for those standard trees. And you may need to bring in the chainsaw to kind of get some of those bigger limbs. This is a good time, especially with pruning, and if you don't have as much snow cover, to recognize that you need to kind of get the tree in shape and prepared for any pest problems that might happen this season. So certainly, as we're thinking about making cuts of the tree, we're going to come in kind of right where cut correctly during dormancy. So you see here this thinning cut where I'm coming back right where that big limb is, and right where there's a little bit of a bump, right where my arrow is where I'm going to be making a cut there. I don't want to cut into it. I just want to cut right at the edge to ensure that I'm not having any kind of issues with it not healing up or sealing up properly. As mentioned previously, we want to think about using rubbing alcohol or some kind of solution to ensure that as we go from tree to tree, that we're not spreading disease. And then this is also a good time to recognize that sometimes apple scab and other diseases and pest problems can be underneath that tree. Any leaves that have dropped between the fall and the spring, or rather the fall and the winter, if they overwinter into our wet springs underneath the canopy of the tree, apple scab can move up into that tree. The wetness can move the spores right up into it. And especially if you have a tree that is very susceptible to the apple scab and other diseases and pests, this would be a good time to remove the debris, destroy it, to ensure that you don't have this issue. As mentioned today as well, you could do dormant spraying if you like. That dormant spray, yet again, about 30 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit is when this could go. So you might expect this the end of March, first week of April to use it for those smaller insects. Read the label on that product if that's the route you want to go to. When we think about these bigger cuts, especially if it's a very large limb, a very dominant limb on that tree that we're going to take out, we want to actually do a couple of little cuts. And the reason for this is that we don't want to do a single cut right at, say, the trunk of the tree, because it's possible that that could be such a dominant weight that it could break off and damage the main trunk, the main central leader. And any sort of damage in the central leader could really open that tree up and make it susceptible for disease problems, for future death as well. So it's really important to, kind of do a couple of very small cuts that you see here in this drawing before then doing our final cut, right to where we have a bit of a bump there against that tree. So you see kind of that first cut being underneath the branch, the second cut being above the top of that main branch, and then your final cut is there near where that collar is, just to even out and ensure that you're not making too big just to ensure that the weight is distributed more than anything. So where to make that cut then? And this is a question we get a lot is, if I want to keep this branch, or say I want to remove this branch, how should I make these cuts? How close should they be? Where should they be? How should I really think about this? So on the left here, you see the spurs. You see the apple spurs, and you also see the pear spurs as well. And so these spurs is where the fruit buds are going to develop. These spurs tend to live for about 6 to 10 years. Sometimes they live a little bit longer than that. And they will be covering the scaffold branches that you have in place. Most new spurs develop on 2-year-old wood. And so it does tend to be also connected with getting a good amount of sunlight here as well. So as you think about maybe a pyramid kind of Christmas tree shape and kind of these scaffold branches at the lower base that are very horizontal, you will find that they will be covered in these spurs if they are of age. When it comes to, say, kind of pruning them or kind of pruning back on some of these branches, you see here this top photo here where, okay, if I want to keep this branch, but it's maybe too long, I would come back to that spur that I want to keep, and I would go from there a 1/2 inch forward and do what's called a bevel cut. That slant you see there is a bevel cut. Another way to also thinking about this is that when you are pruning, you're doing a mixture of heading cuts and what we would call thinning cuts. And so a heading cut then is going to be that I'm going to keep this branch in place, but I'm going to cut it right there at the end. And when you do a heading cut, like you see here with that where my marker is, that will in most cases spur additional growth from where that cut was. So you may find that you will have a lot more growth of, say, water sprouts or shoots that develop from here in that season. That's also why when we talk about topping a tree, you're basically doing a heading cut, which is then producing all of this new growth from it. This heading cut can be useful. It does tend to stiffen that limb. So if it's a limb that you want that's just a little bit too long, or as you kind of see in my drawing, it's going 3 different directions that I don't want it to go in, this can be very useful. But just know that most cases a heading cut is going to lead to growth from that location. This is very important for young trees and kind of even if you're rejuvenating a limb, this can also be very helpful to do a heading cut, or you might hear it called a tipping cut as well. The other cut then is a thinning cut, and the thinning cut is cutting all the way back to where the origin of that limb is. So if we take this example where we have this limb we're taking out, This thinning cut is all the way back to where the main trunk of the tree is. The thinning cut tends to help improve light penetration. It tends to also encourage better fruit production, and it will also just encourage more enhanced productivity more than anything. Realistically, we're trying to do more thinning cuts than we are doing heading cuts. We're trying to reduce the amounts of limbs and getting them closer to their origin, whether that's at the trunk of the tree, whether that's right kind of a secondary part of the scaffold we want to keep. But we're trying to do more thinning cuts than we are heading cuts to reduce the amount of growth and to reduce the amount of foliage that can develop too. So let's get into kind of some of the central leader tree structure then. So yet again, we're talking about our palm fruits, we're talking about apples and pears, and yes, occasionally our stone fruit can be okay on central leader structure. So we're looking for that Christmas tree shape. We're looking at a pyramid shape with this. So ideally, you have what's called a central leader, and it's this central leader here in the green here. And off of this main central trunk branch, we're going to have scaffold branches in the blue. These scaffold branches are going to be potentially 24 to say 36 inches between each one. So almost having 2 to 3 layers, levels, depending on the height. The scaffold branches also tend to be very horizontal as possible. That's really what we're aiming for. And then we also do not want them to provide shade for one another. We really want them kind of going right around in the circle around the central leader. We also see somewhat kind of 6 to 12 inches between them in circle, if you will, with it. And typically your first scaffold level is about 2 to 3 feet from that soil line is really what you're aiming towards. But it is these scaffolds that are going to be producing the fruit. They're going to have the spurs on them for your pears as well as your apples. You will have suckers. So suckers at the base of the tree, the yellow. These are very common most seasons. And these are ones that can easily come out from the tree because they're just not serving you much purpose at this point. You would also have water sprouts. These are red, these are purple in the drawing here, and they're just covering the tree. And sometimes these are ones that when we think about, say, a thinning cut, I could come through and remove them right to where they meet the scaffold to really allow for better light penetration and to allow for the scaffold to be in much better shape with it too. You might also have additional water sprouts that are growing into the tree, that are growing down from the tree, that are just not serving you much purpose based on where they're growing and how they're growing. We also may have, we also want to look at our crotch angles. So how is a scaffold fitting close to that tree? And you can see here in this photo that we're aiming for about 45 to 60 degrees is really what we're after up against the tree. So it should be that kind of angle to allow for good support from the scaffold and that central leader. So as you think about your tree, try to find a leader. When I have looked at photos that folks have sent in, when I've looked at my own fruit tree photos, I take a photo of the tree and then I step back and say like, okay, where is a central leader? Especially if it's the apples and the pears is what we're really after. And then once I locate that central leader, I then think about that 30 to 40%. So dead wood's going to come out every year. It's going to be pretty noticeable what the dead wood also looks like. I'm going to remove water sprouts because they're just not serving me any purpose at this point. And then I'll start to really think about some of those limbs that are growing into the tree. They're growing downward. They're growing kind of almost completely vertical as kind of a secondary scaffold. And they're just really interfering with the tree productivity. And I need to take these out. And then we're looking for crosses. Maybe limbs are growing on top of one another and they'll need to come out with this. This is also a good time that as you're thinking about removing, also look for replacements. If you find that your scaffolds are so high up in that tree that you want to bring them down, you want to look for replacements and you want to see if there's any replacements further down that you could help with this. This is also a great time where, okay, you may find that you have a great scaffold that's growing very horizontal, and yet it's growing up at direction you don't like at the end. And so you might come back and actually cut it and then see what growth happens from that heading cut. But find your big cut. I think that's what I really find with most trees that have not been properly pruned or haven't been pruned for, say, a couple of years, is that there's a big cut and there may be many big cuts on that tree that could really help you figure out what you need to do. And by taking out a big limb, by doing that thinning cut, it could dramatically change that tree, and it could dramatically change how the sunlight is getting into that tree. So in this drawing, you see some of what would be pruned out. You see diseased branches, you see there are dead branches that would come out. Kind of any of those suckers that would kind of grow from the base of the tree would be coming out as well from it, because they're just not serving a purpose here. They're taking energy away. So they would come from the trunk and they would come from the roots. We might also look to remove some of the broken branches that are happening at this point. And in that scenario, we want to think about where the cut needs to be made. So it could be it goes all the way back to its origin, right where it starts, or you may find for your tree that you just want to cut it and potentially that heading cut to lead to some additional growth that could extend that scaffold that you might want to keep. Certainly crossing branches, and then you're going to have a lot of water shoots. That's what you're going to encounter, is that there's going to be quite a lot of water shoots that will potentially could come out. Yet again, that's a thinning cut there, but we still want to think about reducing cuts. So if it was a branch that had a number of water shoots, you might try to cut it in a way that would ensure that you don't have as much water shoots develop. So instead of maybe 6 cuts for the water shoots, it could be you're cutting it at a place that maybe reduces it down to 1. That would still be wanting to balance out a heading cut versus a thinning cut, but would be something to consider. So here are some examples of things that could easily start to come out, or really ways to really think about removal. You see dead wood here on the left, very noticeable. This would not be something that would be added to that 30 to 40% of what we're after. You would consider this something that definitely has to come out, and it would be dead wood and very noticeable. On the opposite side in this photo, especially for, say, an older neglected tree, you may have a lot going on. You have crosses, you have vertical, downward, inward. You maybe have a lot of that happening. And so it is kind of looking at some of these scaffolds or secondary scaffolds really, and seeing if 1 or 2 of them could come out, which could then allow for the other scaffolds and the other branches you want to keep to breathe, to get light penetration, and to allow for a much better growth of that tree. Suckers are noticeable here on the left, this fruit tree. So kind of right at the base of the tree, all that is coming out. It's not serving me any purpose here. And it's easy growth that can easily be removed kind of in that growing season. You may also find with your fruit trees over here on the right, that there are competing leaders. While we might consider the competing leader almost like a scaffold that is kind of taken over for some time, you may find that the leaders are very similar in trunk width, in the way they dominate the tree. And you may just have to accept that your tree is not going to look like you were hoping it to look. So some other issues that you can encounter. Certainly bird damage, we've seen for some trees, whether it's woodpeckers or others that lead to damage. We would recommend kind of a burlap wrap around certain areas, and a loose fitting burlap wrap, it should be stated. If you had trees with seasonal weather damage, provide support if needed. Try to provide support, especially if it's fallen over, and just see how the tree performs and how the tree reacts. And kind of go from there and see what you can do the next couple of years. If there's any limb loss during the season, say there's a wind weather pattern, there's something that's happened, say in September or August or another time that's unideal with your pruning plan, try to remediate, don't apply sealant, and then also hope for recovery for that tree. One of the other things to kind of consider there is that if you had severe limb loss on the fruit tree, you may not be doing as much fruit tree pruning in the dormancy season. Consider that limb loss part of that 30 to 40% in a single calendar year. And so what that may mean is that if you had limb loss in August or September and you remediated it and pruned it back to a degree, you may not be doing much pruning in the winter because you still want to think about it in that 30 to 40% time frame. Other issues that happen, deer, wildlife damage. This may also lessen and lead to you not pruning for the season. You see here, even with deer protection and other things, I still had some deer pruning done on one of my peach trees, a peach tree that's no longer here at this point. Try to use deer guard, remove mulch around the base of the tree for any smaller mammals. We would recommend having a bare area around the base of the fruit tree. You could also maybe try gravel, could also be something you put around the tree if you wanted to address weed control. Soap deterrent, some of those Irish Spring, some of those other ones are available too. You might also, if you had a couple of trees, look for hot pepper spray. Folks have had some good success with this where it's sprayed on the foliage. The only thing to mention here is that some of the hot pepper spray is not listed for edible crops. It is only listed for ornamentals. So you do want to purchase hot pepper spray that is for edible crops. If you had any deep cuts into the leader, whether it was damage, whether it was just something that you've noticed over time, you may try to switch out the leader. So it could be that you spend a couple of years hoping that a sucker from the rootstock could take over. But you may also find that your tree may be on kind of a slow march towards its death. So kind of recognize that might be an issue as well. We hate that that happens, but it is sometimes what occurs with these deep cuts in the leader, especially if any tree damage has happened. So one of the ways that I approach pruning is to go out on a sunny day and take photos of my tree. And you all have submitted photos to me today, which is great. And I'll share some of them as we go along today. But by having a good photo on a sunny day, it can help me figure out how I need to prune this tree. Originally, when I started this color-coded method, I was using Microsoft Paint. I've since switched over to using an iPad and using an Apple Pencil. But I take this idea of, okay, where's my central leader? I'm going to give it a green color. And so that's going to be my color code for the green level. And then I'm going to try to figure out where the lateral branches are, where my scaffold branches are, and I'll place them in the blue. And then from there, I'll look maybe for red, for the water sprouts, or maybe those smaller replacement branches. And then finally, I'll tend to see if I could find a big cut. And so I might kind of mark that with a star, which you see here. By having kind of a color-coded system to go with, this begins to help me figure out what the tree shape is, what the tree shape could be, and even what the tree will never look like, you know, having kind of an acceptance of what that tree is really dealing with. And it begins to help me also think about what replacement branches need to look like. You see on this tree is a great example where, you know, the scaffold branch is really low on the left side where that blue star is. So that would need to come out. It also is a scaffold branch that's almost growing directly up into that tree. So doing a nice, clean, thinning cut could really help those additional levels of scaffolds that I have in place, or that I hope to maybe keep in place. The other thing you can even see then on this tree is that I need to maybe even it out, especially if I'm going to keep that next blue scaffold level, is to even it out, try to kind of get some maintenance in here. The other thing that this helps me to notice is like, well, I've got some areas here in the red, the water sprouts, that a normal year I might be pruning out. And yet by actually kind of visualizing it with some photos, I can actually begin to see that I might want to keep one of these and allow it to be a scaffold over time. Do a little bit of training, pull the branches back, you know, hopefully try to keep it at a more of that horizontal shape that it's really after with it too. This isn't a perfect method. And as you can imagine, we're just talking about a 2D image compared to walking around this tree. But at least by having some photos in mind and kind of thinking about what your visuals need to look like, this can help you get down that path of thinking about what the tree shape should be and what branches should come out, what should stay, as well as kind of what the next year's branches and others could look like too. So here is another one of our trees from the family orchard. And so you kind of notice, especially on the right side here, is we can see a bit of a central leader structure in there. We might almost consider it that we've got two competing leaders, if you will. It's kind of based on the width of those structures. But one of the very noticeable things, especially on the left side with that blue scaffold, is that it's a really dominant scaffold. And the other thing to recognize is that especially with the fruit spurs of apples only living for 6 to 10 years, it's possible that almost all of that scaffold does not have any spurs. You can really even see that there are no spurs on that scaffold. And while it's good, I mean, it's a good structure to have, it is one that could easily be eliminated. The other problem, especially with that blue scaffold there on the left, is that it has a very large width to it. And so it is one that should be removed based on how big of a width it is in comparison to what that kind of central leader is and what we ideally think the central leader looks like too. Potentially, if I was to say keep this scaffold in place, I could maybe do a heading cut and see what develops from it, kind of do a renewal cutting, if you will, and see how that really goes. But as you can kind of see with these trees and some of the trees in the background, some of what we're dealing with, at least in my family, is a lot of toleration trees. That they're older trees, they could get into shape, but we're just going to try to go in here and try to remove some of those very problematic limbs that are really impacting the tree and the tree health. One of the other ones from earlier, this is, I think, Wolf River. You can see that it is covered with lichen. That can be a very big problem sometimes in some orchards. I will say that it's not too big of an issue for this orchard at least. But you can see a good central leader structure. Almost everything in the red needs to come out because it's very vertical in its shape. So it's heavy on foliage, much more than it is in fruit bud production. And then the other problem is there on the right. So you can see how low that blue scaffold branch is. It needs to be much higher up. So realistically, most of the red would come out and then we would remove that blue branch there on the left, or rather the right, because of its shape. The other thing I would probably also look at too is just to make sure that some of these scaffolds are really evened out. And most likely these scaffolds are missing some of that apple buds that we really need. And so over time, I would probably be removing most of these scaffolds because they don't have any fruit on them. And they are so old that removing of them should reinvigorate this tree and allow me to have new scaffolds develop and then have spur development develop too. Here's a dwarf tree from one of our Freeport High School orchards. And so you can see here, when you think about a younger tree, and you can actually see some of the spurs that are on this tree as well, which is great to see. But we've got a good, strong central leader there in the green. We've got areas on both the right and the left in the red that could come out, some of which is because that first scaffold level is a little bit too low to where it needs to be. So anything at the base would come out, anything in red, especially high, immediately up from the base of that tree would come out because the scaffold level is too low. But it's a perfect candidate for training, pushing these branches back with pieces of wood that would really allow for us to get into that good Christmas tree shape that we're really after. The other thing you also notice here is what I, in my mind, felt was we could do a little bit of a cut there in the black, that while it is a heading cut on that branch, it would allow us to then start to begin to get a better shape for that scaffold that you see there on the left. The other side, though, is a little bit busy, and we need to maybe do some very quick thinning out there to kind of reduce that. So even though it's, maybe 4 or 5 years old, there still are opportunities to prune some, but would still say that, if you're trying to get closer to harvest, you might focus more on training the branches, pushing the branches out with pieces of wood, with string, with other weights, and getting that tree shape that you're really after, and then worry about it maybe a little bit later, maybe year 5 or year 6. At the same time, thinking about 30 to 40% of the branches coming out on this tree is not a lot compared to, say, a standard tree. So here is a great example of some of the fruit trees that we work with in Joe Davis County and Stevenson County. This is one of our former coworkers who had a fruit tree that you see here, which produces very well, is what she shares. In trying to even wrap your head around this tree shape, there's a bit of some central leader in there. There's a bit of some scaffolds in there as well. The problem, though, is that it's a much older tree, and the newer growth is probably occurring higher up in the tree. And so we probably need to be pruning out a lot of those scaffold branches closer to height level that we could realistically get to, because in most cases these scaffolds are no longer have spurs on them, and we need to kind of try to get some replacements in here. It's not going to be perfect because of the height of the tree. There's a strong chance that it's really putting a lot of shade in further levels down from that tree. But the tree has had good years of fruit. That's what our coworker has said before. And so just by giving it some bit of attention, especially trying to clean up some that's growing into the tree, that's doing crosses, that's really putting a lot of shade in here, it's quite possible that we can try to get into some form, if you will. This is a tree that is in my family orchard, and this is one great example of competing leaders. So because they are almost even when it comes to the split, this is one tree that we would not recommend taking out a leader. It's too old at this point, and also you just note how dominant both of these leaders are. It should have been caught early on. And that's something to really consider, is that if you are starting to notice a bit of a competing leader, it may be better for you to go ahead and remove a leader early on than to let it get down the road where it's such a dominant part of the tree that you can't really do much about it. So with this tree being more of a toleration, we do have scaffolds in place, but we may have better focus is to do some replacement scaffolds and to look lower on that tree, see if we could really develop some scaffolds from there that could get the fruit closer to us. The challenge is that this needs to be balanced. And so you're going to be balancing it out on both sides to ensure that the tree is getting the scaffold balance it needs. This is a tree that some of the participants from Dubuque Arboretum submitted last week in our fruit tree pruning class. And so this is a Liberty fruit tree. I think it's about 4 or 5 years old. You can see here that they've got some really nice scaffolds in place already, but we need to start doing more training for them because they're just getting more vertical, much more than what we're really after here on these trees. There's also a couple of places here where cleaning up some of these scaffolds could really just help the other scaffolds on that tree. And that's something to really consider with a younger tree, is that if you could do some of these thinning cuts, it could really help out the other scaffolds that you want to keep, and then have the ability to see how that tree performs, see how the tree really reacts to less of those scaffolds in place. Yet again, 30 to 40% limbs coming out is not going to be too much for some of these very young trees. One of the other fruit trees in the same arboretum, as you can see here, we've got a mess. We have a heavy amount of scaffolds on both the right and the left. And there are opportunities in there to remove some of these scaffolds that would dramatically change and impact the rest of those scaffolds. So as they look at these trees, they've got a good first level of a scaffold there. They've got a good second level of the scaffold. But once you kind of get higher up into this semi-dwarf tree, we've got some problems that we need to really address. And we really need to think about balancing out the scaffold load and doing some thinning cuts right back to that central leader that can really help the rest of the scaffolds that we want to keep in place. This is also still a good candidate for training, kind of pushing back some of those scaffold branches down to kind of keep that horizontal shape with it. Because at this point, as much as you might think about maybe delaying some of the pruning, this is one where there's so much aggressive growth that you're at a place where you probably want to go ahead and go in there and do some pruning, because by keeping those branches in place and not pruning some of them out, it's impacting the other branches that you want to keep. It's really putting a lot of dominant pressure on those other branches. Another fruit tree to show you. So you can kind of see here, kind of similar principles. We've got that good central leader. We just got a lot of little areas where we've got some dominant scaffolds. And I kind of noted in this photo here on the left, or right rather, where with a white star, you could probably come in there and take out that one branch. And then on the right side, you can kind of see that some of those scaffolds are growing a little bit more awkward and pretty much crossing into a couple of more branches. So it's just too busy. That's realistically what is happening with this fruit tree. It's just way too busy for what you're really after here with this tree. And so you really want to think about kind of evening out and kind of cleaning up the scaffolds on both the right and the left side. It also is a place where you can maybe see that, you know, based on this image, there is a good central leader. And so we may just want to refocus back to that central leader, because what it looks like from here on this apple tree is that most of the scaffold branches are right there, about 3 feet from where that soil line is. And we need to space them out. We need to space them out higher up in that tree. So let's look at some of your trees, some of the trees that you sent in. And please note that I didn't use everyone's trees. And certainly if you have sent me trees, I will send them back to you color-coded with some advice. And you also have the opportunity to send me trees after this class as well, if you'd like some additional assistance and guidance. So Todd sent in this tree, and I don't think he's here with us today, but you can see with his fruit tree that we can find a central leader. You know, looking at this tree, there looks to me to be a very defined central leader. The problem is there's too many scaffolds, and you can see that there's a couple of places here, I think especially lower on the tree, that scaffolds could be removed. And by doing a bit of a thinning cut there on the right and the left, taking out a pretty sizable branch on both right and left, could really open up the rest of that tree. It's also one where if you think about that 30 to 40%, what could come out every year, he's got some work cut out for him, where every year could be another big cut, and really trying to kind of balance out the scaffold load and move them back to that central leader. Because you really notice, especially on the right, that that first scaffold branch on the right there has a secondary scaffold. And you'll note I kind of did a white circle there. And I'm concerned that as that one gets bigger and bigger, a bigger width, it's going to put so much pressure on that bottom scaffold that it's liable to break off. That's something to really think about with these scaffolds, is that as they get bigger and bigger, a bigger width, they're putting so much weight and so much pressure on these limbs that it's very liable that they could snap, and very liable that could cause some problems. But you see with his tree, there are places that could be removed that could bring in the light. There are places where scaffolds could be taken out that could dramatically change this tree. But he also wants to look for scaffolds and see if it's time to replace them, because as you look at these, they look pretty old, and they just may have more foliage than actual fruit buds. This is Hank's young pear tree. And so, you know, based on the age of the tree and kind of based on the structure that you see here, Hank, you do have a good defined central leader. I think higher up in the tree, you have the ability to maybe decide the direction of a central leader. I just colored some additional green there just to say, those are probably scaffolds. You could just take them out there. But you see, you've got some direction there. But what you do have, especially on the right here, is you have a bit more of a dominance of blue scaffolds. And we want to think about balancing them out. We really want to take the right side there and really get a bit more well-defined scaffold level, some of which are pretty dominant. You could kind of prune out because they're not doing what they need to do. They're growing into the tree. They're growing too close up against the tree. They don't have a good crouch angle. But we want to think about pruning those out and then balancing them out on the left side. So trying to kind of give a better balance to it. Because of the age and because of the growth at this point, I think you've got potential to go ahead and do 30 to 40% of the pruning on this tree and try to kind of address a problem early on, getting scaffolds on the left and kind of balancing it out on the right. This is John's apple tree. And so with John's apple tree, you see he's got a good defined central leader, but you kind of note that he's got a bit of scaffolds kind of growing in different directions. And while you could, I think, John, find a good, solid kind of additional direction for the central leader, kind of based on what the photo looks like here, I think I would also look to see if you've got bud spur development on these scaffolds. They're getting a great amount of sunlight, which is great, but my fear is that they may be much older and you may not be getting as much fruit off of them as you might be expecting. And so it could be that you come in there and maybe try to remove a couple of scaffolds that are just a little bit of an awkward shape to it. The other thing to mention, especially on your tree, John, is that you want to think about the width of the scaffold, because some of these might be getting a bit more, a wider width to them than the actual main central trunk. And we don't want that. We want to ensure that the central trunk, the central leader trunk, is the biggest part, the biggest width of that tree. Because if you've got scaffolds that are getting close to that or further than the width of the central leader, it's liable that as they get bigger, they could break. So that would be kind of my thing to consider, is look at your scaffold, see if you've got bud development, because you may find that you need to kind of remove one or two of them with it. It's getting a great amount of sunlight, and it's a very, in my opinion, kind of a very well balanced tree. You note that there is a lot of water sprouts on the tree too. And so that some of those could be cleaned out. Yet again, that may lead to more water sprout development, since sometimes that's how they tend to go. But certainly, I think you just want to check on your scaffolds and look for any kind of spur development. This is Debbie's tree. This is a Grimes Golden. This is a 2-year-old apple tree. So Debbie, you've already got your well-defined central leader. I think it is younger, so you don't necessarily have to prune this year. You could wait a little bit longer. But what I would say is that if you have the ability, try to begin to get these branches kind of bent down a little bit and try to kind of get that kind of shape in place, kind of train those branches. I know you mentioned you had some deer issues, and so that's why you have protection, which I certainly get. But I just certainly recognize that you may not have the ability to necessarily train them in the right shape that you're really after. The other thing to maybe look at too, especially on the height of this tree, is where that first kind of scaffold level is. So if you have this is say a dwarf tree, you would still probably want to start at about 2 feet for that scaffold level. And so what you may find is that the scaffold level is a little bit too low, that first level on this tree with it too. But it's in pretty good solid shape. But trying to get some training in here, I know it's going to be a battle with the deer, of course, but I would say trying to do that would be good, especially for a very young tree. I think it's okay that there's a lot of growth right now. I would focus more on training because of the age of the tree than I would necessarily on some of the pruning. So trying to kind of bend back some of those scaffold branches to that tree shape we're really after. Taylor, you sent in this crab apple tree. One thing I would say for your crab apple is that you mentioned it was a younger tree. You do want to look to actually have a support system for this. And that's why I did on that black drawing was, okay, let's put a stake with this tree because it's very young. It needs a good staking just to ensure that it kind of keeps its right form. What I would also say is that, to me, we might try to take that blue branch that you see here and kind of bend it over and keep it straight and make it into that central leader. Because as of right now, it looks to me like it kind of just tapers off a little bit. So having a good stake in place, keeping it straight, and then moving that blue branch over and then having it kind of take over as a central leader would be really a good thing to do. This is a younger tree, as you shared, and so you may not really want to prune for a couple of years here. Give it a little more time to get into its shape. You could do a little small pruning, kind of cleaning up some of these little areas where the scaffolds are potentially too close. But I would certainly say try to push things over, get a good central leader kind of taken over in that shape. And Stephen, I know you sent a couple of other photos in too, but I thought this one was a great one to really share, to really convey that, even with regular pruning every year, especially for participants that maybe haven't done any pruning, that, the growth in the summer, especially for some of these fruit trees, especially this one that's an enterprise that's 11 years old, can still be aggressive. And it can still be something that you really have to really balance out with it. I think in your situation, Stephen, especially knowing that you're a commercial scale and you're selling to individuals, it's really doing some of those thinning cuts, kind of going in there, removing some of the branches that might really be interfering, and yet again, matching it up with what you're really after with the productivity of your tree too, with what the end goal and that purpose is, as far as whether it's you pick or as far as it's for other purposes. I think you do see where there could be some scaffold renewal, especially I think on kind of the right side. I think that some of those scaffolds are maybe potentially a little bit too low, depending on where they're at and kind of the interference that they might be having. But yet again, just kind of knowing that you're pruning these very regularly, focusing on thinning cuts more than probably the heading cuts would be something to really consider, especially if there's a couple limbs in here that are getting closer to age. I kind of noticed that, especially kind of on the right side there and kind of that area, that there's some dominant scaffolds there that could be cleaned up to kind of provide a bit more renewal for some of those younger ones. So more photos to come as we'll shift over into stone fruit in just a little bit. And thank you all for submitting those photos. And yet again, I'll color more of them. I'll send it back. I'm more than happy to do that for you. So as you think about, you've gone through a checklist of the deadwood has come out, you have removed the suckers, perhaps you have really thought more about the scaffold branches that you want in place. Your next step might be upper limbs. So looking higher up in the tree, if you have the capability to remove them, especially if it's a limb that is interfering with the tree's productivity and casting lots of shade on it. You might have the ability to think about competing leaders or competing scaffolds even, ones that are really interfering with how that tree is after. And then this might be a good time to think about scaffold replacement. So it is that making a cut all the way back to where that tree trunk is might be very helpful to then encourage growth from other scaffolds or other ones. But it could also be that maybe you have a scaffold that's going the direction you don't want. And by doing a heading cut, you have the ability to see what growth will occur from that and do some renewal from it. Also look to better crotch angles, and that can help with training where I'm pushing some of those limbs down with it. I always think about assessing your cuts into the summer and next winter. See how the tree reacts. See what the sunlight really looks like when it comes to getting to that tree and bringing into the tree. Because as much as you can say that this is the limbs that's coming out in 2022 or 2023 rather, the tree may have a different idea. The tree may think differently. When you see this drawing here, this scaffold on the left, it may be that this scaffold is having a number of thinning cuts where I'm going right where the origin of that branch is, as you see there in the red and in the middle of the branch. And then it could also be that I'm doing a heading cut there at the edge just to see if I can get a better growth for the direction I want that scaffold to go. But it's going to be a lot of balance. And as you can also imagine too, is at this, we're looking at this, I have now 5 cuts on this branch compared to say if I had just done maybe 1 cut. We're trying to really reduce the cuts as I can. So to reiterate, look for the replacements, look after fruit fall, especially in July. You will have natural fruit fall occur, and this can help you really think about where the fruit is on the tree and to really kind of balance it out. I always say, think about the weight loss, have some patience, and look for the light. See how that light is coming into the tree, and think about what year or 2 of renovation can really look like. So you can see in this photo, this was that Virginia Beauty variety that we did earlier, that you saw earlier. So 3 very dominant scaffolds at this point that are not producing. And yet, because of the dominance of that tree, we really wanted to come back and cut them. You kind of notice here that this was a thinning cut that was made. And because of that thinning cut, it then produced additional growth from around where that cut was made. And so you can see here that options have developed. And so I could have 1 or 2 of these take over as a scaffold if I so chose. The problem though is that, these are 3 dominant limbs, and realistically 1 comes out each year with them. You see in this tree, after a season of pruning has been done in the wintertime, I now have basically some additional scaffold replacements. It is noticeable that, as I think about this tree, I think I've got 2 directions that the central leader goes. And so it is that on the left, I can focus on bringing scaffolds there, choosing one of those branches to be a scaffold replacement. And then on the right there, I have the ability to slowly prune that one back by doing some heading cuts. It's not going to be perfect, but that limb is just a little bit in the direction I don't like to be, that central leader. So on to the stone fruit. It's important to recognize that everything we've talked about as far as how to prune, what to prune, and when, all applies to stone fruit. That 30 to 40%, the dead wood, the limbs that are interfering, all of those pieces are applicable to this group. However, we're after a different shape. We're after a different direction here. So as we think about an open fruit bowl shape, we really have a single trunk that's about 18 to 30 inches high. And then we have 2 to 5 scaffold branches kind of close together vertically. And we have crotch angles about 40 to 90 degrees here. You see this a little bit more here with this cherry tree. So you saw the cherry tree photo earlier. This is what the cherry tree looks like when it has foliage on it. And you can see that, we do have the ability to get it in a vase shape. It was planted the same time as peaches 10, 12 years ago before me. I have the ability to try to kind of get these scaffolds, that 18 to 30 inches high, but it may take some time. And it may be that it's maybe better off to accept that this is the shape this tree is going to be. The pyramid Christmas tree shape is possible for this group. It really just depends on what you're after. But just know that that's really what we're thinking about, is 2 to 5 scaffold branches kind of creating this open fruit bowl shape. And so what we mean is this over here. So you see we've got this open center pruning where, especially if you were just planting it, you have a bit of a heading cut here, and you're creating kind of an open fruit bowl shape to it where the scaffold branches are tending to grow much more vertically, kind of more open center, if you will, than they are going to be that horizontal shape that works really well for our pears and apples. So realistically, a first year spring could have a heading cut, then you're following up with some additional cuts to eventually get some really well established scaffolds in place. That's really what you're aiming for and the shape you're really after for those next couple of years. When you think about, okay, where's the fruit buds, where's the fruit on the trees themselves, peach spurs and a lot of the other spurs, or rather fruit buds, they do not live as long as apple or pear. The peaches is typically last year's growth. is where the peach buds are going to show up. And usually they last 1 to 3 years, but peach is always going to be young wood. You see in this photo here, this is your peach bud. And you would see this today. You could go out and look at your stone fruit for peaches and see this. Cherries look a little bit different, but realistically, you've got your stone fruit, your peach bud there. Higher up on this limb, you can actually see a leaf bud. So the leaf bud does not have that center bud, it just has the leaf. This is one of our peach trees at the Rockford office. So heavy producer, this is I believe it's a Reliance peach tree. It was not pruned for close to 8 or so years, so it got really aggressive in its growth. It also has multiple central leaders at this point too. So realistically, over time, what I've tried to do is remove some of these central leaders and try to balance it out to some form of a fruit bowl shape or some form of an open center vase shape, but it certainly is not ideal. And it is something where a lot of the fruit is higher up in the tree, and we also have very poor years of peach production. So it is one that's always kind of in balance, if you will, with it. So this is a bit of a toleration pruning where we're trying to get the scaffolds closer to us, knowing full well that peach trees produce on 1-year-old wood or wood from the previous summer, and also trying to potentially remove a couple of these central leaders to get it back into shape. The other thing we have to accept is that this is the park district, and the park district needs to mow under these peach trees. So we have to balance that out when it comes to the shape we're after. It's not perfect, is what I'm getting at. From one of our class participants, Karin sent this peach tree in, and this is something that he's encountered is that he's dealing with a lot of dead wood. And so what he's noticed over time is that this central leader, if you will, of this peach tree is showing some signs of damage and of dead wood. And his question was, what should I do? Should I cut it back? Should I remove it and replace it? And as I look at this tree, especially as you look at the left side and the right side, there is a bit of a central leader in here and potentially even multiple central leaders. But you also note there's a little bit of growth there right where that kind of line is. So in thinking about what you could do, especially if you wanted to keep this peach tree, was to see what happens if you cut it right where that line is. See if you get any growth from there, or if it's possible to allow for that one singular growth to kind of take over the central leader direction. It's also possible, as much as I marked in green, multiple central leaders, that you could also do that as well. Just as I showed you with my example with the Rockford peach tree, where it's not perfect. It is not perfect at all. And yet we are dealing with multiple central leaders kind of coming from that one graft union where the peach is at. So it's possible to do that, but it's something that's going to take some time, and it's going to kind of be up to you, Karin, to decide kind of what you want to do as we talked about a little bit as well with it, that you've got some options. It may not ever get that fruit bowl open vase shape you're after, but I think you have the ability to maybe remediate it and then see if you end up with multiple central leaders, kind of in the example of peach trees that I've shown you. Debbie submitted this photo of a North Star cherry. So this is a 3-year-old cherry tree. And you note that we do have a bit of a central leader in some ways. And so it could be that we decide to kind of have a central leader structure, or we could actually kind of shift it over to that open fruit bowl shape. You would want to just kind of look and see if you have your scaffold developments in place. I do think that some of them are a little bit too low on that tree, especially there on the right. You kind of see they're a little bit too low. The other thing to note is, this is pretty good growth of your cherry tree as well. So, you could give it a year and see how it performs, but you might also decide to do a little bit of pruning of it this season too. But this would be a great candidate to do some training, trying to kind of bend those branches back just a little bit more to get a bit more of that open shape to it, to allow for good airflow and allow for some really good wind pollination too. This is a peach tree that Hank submitted. And so what I noticed with this tree especially, and I tried to mark it up here, Hank, was that you've got a very dominant right side, and this is a little bit too low. It's a little bit too low on this tree. My thought with this, just based on what I see from a 2D place, is that I don't think you could take out that whole branch. I think I would actually come in there and I would do 2 cuts on the scaffold there and maybe do a heading back cut right where I've marked 20 and 22. And then you might try over time to kind of eliminate that right side. My concern is it's too low on the tree. That's really it. And it's also a pretty dominant part of the tree. And then the other thing you kind of notice is that those 2 scaffold branches are a little bit in a weird shape to them where the 20 and 22 is. And then one of them is really dominant and really putting an impact on the rest of that tree too. So my thought is eliminating both of those and then maybe doing a bit of a cutting back of that central leader there on the right, and then kind of eventually in 2023, kind of finish it up. It's not going to be a perfect one, but I think based on the height of the tree, thinking about that 30 to 40%, we potentially have the ability to move that back and kind of help with this. Yet again, you know, one thing to mention is like, these are your trees, this is what I see, but you may see things very differently, you know, and I state that for everyone that I work with too. One of our final trees, this comes from one of our participants last week, and this was one of their, I think this was an actual nectarine tree in Joe Davis County. So it's a little bit younger. You can kind of see that we've got some scaffold developments really in place. We do have a bit of a central leader structure, although we could probably even classify that as a scaffold branch right where it kind of goes up. But you kind of know we're getting more of that kind of open fruit bowl shape. And we just want to think about good airflow. So any branches growing into the tree, growing into our bowl would be ones that we would really want to prune out. There's also little places here where things are just interfering. You've got a little bit of a lower scaffold branch there on the red that I would probably take out or realistically maybe even encourage. And then we've got one on the left, that red scaffold that would come out as well. But really looking at a tree, finding places where branches are crossing each other and interfering, and they're just not ideal, is what we're really after here. One question we do get occasionally is using, should I do any additional thinning? One of the things to really consider with thinning is that you know, folks will ask, you know, should I thin? Do I need to thin? If you feel like you need to thin, recognize that pruning can help with this. Pruning your trees can help balance out the fruit load. So if you have a small scale orchard type approach or not as many trees, we may not recommend thinning. We would say you're probably doing enough. But if you wanted to thin, you would want to really think about kind of working more towards, say, the end of May, first couple of weeks of June would be when we would recommend it in Northern Illinois. And the thinning act would be finding the spurs on your fruit trees and cutting out the fruit that has already developed. So any of those kind of dime-sized apples would be what would be pruned out. You're not removing the spurs. You're just removing the flowers that have developed into small apples. And the reason to wait a little bit longer, and this is kind of around petal fall, is because you could still have a late freeze, you could still have ramifications of a late spring frost and lose fruit because of it. From a backyard setting, you could use thinning chemical like 7. It is one that is used occasionally. Of course, it has to be applied appropriately, so you're not causing any damage to your pollinators. So early in the evening is when we might recommend it. On a commercial scale, there's additional thinning products out there that would be recommended for use. What about additional thinning? You know, additional thinning could be done. You could decide to remove some of the fruit right now at petal fall, and then later on, you could remove some additional ones. But the main thinning action is you follow your scaffold branch, you find your spurs, and then you remove the fruit that's in between spurs that are every 6 inches apart. So you keep the fruit that is spaced every 6 inches, the fruit between those 6 inches, you're thinning out. But yet again, you're not pruning out the spurs, you're just pruning out the fruit. And usually this is done with some hand clippers, some hand pruners. It allows for better fruit size. It also allows for a better kind of evenness of fruit. You don't always need to do this though. So we're getting wrapped up today. So if you have additional questions to add to the chat box, feel free to do that and we'll make sure we get to them today. There's a number of resources listed here. I will send you an email that do direct links to all of the resources that are mentioned here, including our YouTube channel that has additional fruit tree pruning classes from previous years. Inevitably, when I teach this, folks are thinking about adding new fruit trees to the backyard or to the small scale setting. And so there's a number of pollination charts that can help you figure out what types of trees and when they flower and match up really well. We'll also include some disease resistant charts as well from Purdue that helps you determine right varieties. Wisconsin has a wonderful website with a vast amount of production resources on apples and pears. And then one of the links I will give you has apple bud and pear bud stages with color photos of growth. This is really helpful, especially as folks think, well, do I still have the ability to prune or not? Or, what growth stage is my fruit in right now? I find it really valuable to have color photos, especially if this is something that you're just getting started in. And then finally, we'll get some Great Lakes integrated pest management. It's really good for supplies for trapping insects. So some stuff we talked about with pest management, but would say kind of look into these guides further. So as we get wrapped up today and this afternoon, really step back and think about the shape that you're after and bring the light. I'm looking out on an overcast day. This is not the day to go out and look at my fruit trees. It is a very sunny day that will help me determine where the shade is hitting the trees and help me to figure out where the fruit buds are as well. You can see them right now. You can see the spurs as well. But having a good sunny day is going to really help you figure out what really needs to come out and what needs to stay behind. I also encourage you to really find your leader. And it could be that, as I did some folks' photos today, that's not necessarily the leader. And yet having some direction, getting a leader, figuring that out can be really helpful to you. From there, look at the scaffolds. And yes, your scaffold may be in a good shape. However, it may be too old. And it may be that as you look for the spurs on the trees, that they are too old at this point and they're not producing for you. And that's why you don't have fruit. The other thing to consider is that if your scaffolds are 15, 20 feet higher up in the tree, then it maybe is time to bring your scaffolds down and try to encourage scaffolds at lower levels. I always find that almost every fruit tree has a big cut, multiple big cuts, and taking out one of them with a chainsaw, with the equipment you have, especially if it's a good thinning cut right up against where it just starts to grow, can dramatically change that tree and dramatically bring in more light for you and for your journey on this fruit production side of things. Expect a long-term process. This is not that you're done pruning in 2022 and then you don't prune in 2023 or many years to come. This is a yearly process and you just have to accept that, especially for the trees that you're wanting to grow. Make your cuts, but don't stress about the wrong cuts. You can beat yourself up that you have cut the tree wrong, and commercial growers will tell you that they make the wrong cuts all the time. It happens all the time. Getting out there, getting some practice, learning from your mistakes can just dramatically change how you begin to think about pruning and help get you into a good headspace of coming to it. The wrong cut is cutting the tree at the base of the base of the soil line. That's your wrong cut. And you may find that that is the right cut, especially if it's a tree that you don't want anymore. So that's my email. That's my phone number as well. I'm going to turn my camera back on so we can answer some questions. And I'm going to go through the chat box as well. I know I've got some good ones. All right, so one of our first questions came from Steve. Steve, everyone, can I assume that pruning fruit trees can serve as a template for pruning other ornamental trees, such as Japanese maples? It can to some degree, especially as you think about what the ideal tree shape is. But I would also say that, when you think about fruit trees, we're really trying to balance out fruit development and foliage development. And so as you think about more of those ornamentals, you may find that shifts the thinking, that you may not need as much light, that you may not need your, say, central leader structure as defined, that you may also not need those kind of levels as you would for your fruit trees, or your scaffold infrastructure for your fruit trees. So there can be some very similar principles, but we're still focused in a different way in order to get more light to those fruit buds. And you may not need that for some of your ornamentals. Jane asks, so what should you do if trees are too close together? So if they're too close together, and typically an okay rule of thumb is that you should space your trees based on how mature you expect them to reach. So if we think about, say, a semi-dwarf tree, 14 to 16 feet tall, we should space them 14 to 16 feet from each other. And that's a rough estimate, right? Especially if you think about a dwarf tree that matures at 8 to 10 feet, we would probably say space them 10 feet from each other. If they are too close together because of that thing, then you want to ensure that the scaffold branches are spaced out correctly, that they're not putting shade on one another. And you may also find that you need to, unfortunately, factor in how long those scaffold branches could be. It may mean that they need to be reduced on that first level, and then they further need to be reduced higher up because of the impact of that tree. I would also say, look at how not only the shade that's being thrown on that tree by itself, but also see if the shade is being thrown on the other tree as well, and then kind of balance out from there, kind of if need be. So Hank asked, does the 30 to 40% mean that's the max, or that's the amount you should really do every year? Great question. So that's every year. So every year we're looking at 30 to 40% kind of the total cuts is what you should be aiming for every year. With some of your limbs, Hank, when I was looking at, especially that peach tree, it's such a big part, that limb at the side, that if you were to take that out, that's almost 40% of the cut that you would make that year. And you still have more to do. So that's how you kind of factor it in. It's like, okay, 30 to 40% every year is really what you're after there. And that can be a lot on a standard tree. That cannot be a lot on, say, a dwarf or semi-dwarf tree. Yeah, Bill answered that. Sorry about that. Geraldine in the chat box just added she likes to use a reciprocating saw with a pruning blade instead of a chainsaw. Yeah. There was a question, if some leaves with apple scab broke down on the grass under the tree, is there something that can be applied to keep the spores from being produced? Occasionally you can use urea at a certain rate, can be applied underneath on the spores of the apple tree leaves underneath that tree. That can be applied and that can reduce it. That's one option. The other option would be to try to rake them away underneath the tree. But we really want to try to get them out of there before we have any kind of that wet spring where they could hit it and move straight up into the tree. That's kind of the difficulty with that one. I would also check, Geraldine, just to see, if you know the variety of your trees, check to see if they have any disease resistance, because if they have some disease resistance to apple scab, that should also help with that disease pressure. You still could have insect pest problems, so that doesn't completely alleviate it. But if you had some apple scab resistance, that could help quite a bit with it too. So Stephen asks, why not do the big cuts first and then the finer cuts for the sprouts, crosses, and etc. I mean, I would probably agree with that, Stephen. I would probably say start with that big cut first, and then from there add up to it. I don't always think there's a rhyme or reason, what you want to do with it. I think sometimes identifying the big cut first can really kind of give you a good game plan for it. So I would say, try to do the big cut first, or at least identify that, and then factor that into the 30 to 40%. So Hank asked about replacements. So this thing is that, as you're looking at your tree trunk, occasionally, especially for some of the images I drew today, you saw little red marks that I was making. As much as those could all come out, they could also be a replacement. So that could be a replacement scaffold that could be taken out, because you could find you have that good blue limb higher up, and yet you have a little bit of a smaller limb, a sucker, if you will, or water sprout, and that could eventually be the replacement. So that would be what you would do, is you would try to encourage that replacement lower so they could replace it. So Bill asked, dead wood does or doesn't count toward the 30%. We would not really classify the dead wood towards that 30 to 40% because it's something that is not necessarily going to need to be sealed up. It's not something that is really going to be leading to, say, new growth from it. We would consider that not a part of that 30 to 40%. So this question, most of the pruning I've done on my apple trees has been removal of water shoots. I try to remove all of them. Should I only do 40%? So I would still approach things as that 40% of the total tree. And it could be that a large majority is water shoots, but I would also try to reduce the amount of cuts you're making on the water shoots. So if you found that you had a limb, and then you had a number of water shoots on it, I would try to see if you could cut it back to a certain place where it really would reduce the amount of cuts you could be making. So I would still, that may be what compromises that 30 to 40% really quickly. So there's a question in a direct message. Can I do this? Can I do the staking and start the trade to turn the scaffold into more later in the spring after the ground is thawed? This person's considering doing some heading cuts on the branch. This was the crabapple photo, and also remove one or two of the crowded scaffolds, cutting them close to the leader. So yes, that would be my recommendation, is that you could do the staking once the ground doesn't freeze anymore. You could do your pruning right now, and then in the idea with the crabapple is to, of course, kind of direct, create that kind of central leader with it too. So kind of move it over, and that would be fine to do. Let's see. So there's a further question, should we clean up the leaves and rotting apples from previous year? So yes, that would be something that we would recommend underneath the base of the tree, removing them, because this is where apple scab problems could occur. This is also where insect pressure could also occur as well later on in the year too. So removing them from under the tree is really what you're after. We recognize it's a pain to do this action, but it's something that can really help with pest management. So there was a question of, how do we know if a spur is 5 or 6 years old? One thing I would really consider is that, you should be able, this spring, what I would look is to see, first off, right now, locate the spurs. And then this spring, see where the spurs are developing. See if you're getting any spur development, would also be something to consider. And that's not going to necessarily tell you it's a 5 or 6 year old spur, but at least would be able to help you see that you have spurs there and that the spurs are yielding for you. So it's not going to be something that you're going to necessarily see right now. You'll just see where the spurs are located. But in the springtime, you should see them flower and kind of be watching for them to flower. And that can at least kind of get you a timeline for where you're at. The other thing you might consider is actually the width of the scaffold. So if you have a scaffold that has been developed for quite some time, you might recognize that that's a pretty old scaffold at this point. And even if there are spur development on there, you may find that you can already kind of think to yourself, okay, this scaffold is pretty old based on its width and based on how it looks, that I could probably just go ahead and prune that out. So there was a question, why are they called water sprouts, water shoots? It's just a very, just a very common name. It's a good question, Bill, and I cannot recall exactly why they're called that, but I will say that they are kind of those main, they're the main growths from the tree. Wendy stated, I struggle each year to identify my fruit spurs. I trim yearly and shorten most of the new growth back to about 2 to 3 inches. Do you have an image or advice for maintenance pruning? So I would first off, looking for this for the spurs, it's gonna really follow along with very horizontal branches. So if you have any branches that are more vertically, these tend to not have as many spur development on it. Occasionally they do, they don't tend to have many. So I'd really look towards where your scaffolds are developing. And then from there, try to find what looks like spur development. The other thing to mention is that if you have a tree that's very heavily shaded and you know that it is putting a lot of shade on parts of that tree, you're not really going to see many spurs, because spurs tend to develop when there's more light penetration into that tree. So if you notice that it's mostly shade in certain areas, there's going to be a strong chance that the spurs are not there because they're not getting the light that they need right there from it too. There'll be a couple images I'll send that can kind of help you see these a little bit more. But yeah, I would, especially on a sunny day, if you go out, look at your trees and realize that a lot of shade is getting in there and hitting a lot of those scaffold branches, there's probably a good chance that you don't have much spur development because of that. So that takes me through most of the questions. Any final questions you might have? All right, I don't see any at this time, so we're gonna wrap up for the evening. Thanks for joining us tonight. I shared with you, you will get a link to tonight's recording on our YouTube channel. For those that have sent in photos, I will respond back to you with some additional information and advice, and appreciate a lot of the dialogue tonight. When I was trying to use my cursor to explain some of these, I realized I did not have the option in Zoom to use the cursor. So I apologize about that, because it's usually very easy to talk about this with using a cursor, and they have eliminated this from Zoom. So it would have been a little bit easier, I recognize, to explain some of this stuff tonight. Thanks again. Have a great weekend, and certainly we'll be in touch for those that have sent in photos, and send some additional